The venue coordinator called me directly, not my sister, 4 days before her wedding, informing me that the remaining balance of $50,000 was overdue. The vendors were threatening to cancel every single contracted service, and that my name had been listed, without my knowledge or consent, as the designated backup payment contact should my sister's own payment method continue failing. I sat in my car outside my office, phone in hand, engine still running, air conditioning blasting against a warm October afternoon, and felt an entire family pattern I'd spent years quietly tolerating finally, undeniably crystallize into a decision I could no longer avoid making directly. A lifetime of being the reliable one. My name is Jasmine Whitcomb, and my younger sister Courtney was set to marry her fiancé, Blake Sorensen, in a wedding scheduled for that October weekend in 2024. A celebration that had, across the preceding 14 months of planning, grown considerably more elaborate and expensive than either Courtney's own actual budget. Or, as I would soon discover, her actual financial capacity could genuinely support. I need to explain the broader family pattern that made this specific crisis, disorienting as it initially was, not entirely surprising given our established family dynamic, because I don't think this story makes sense without understanding the full 3 decades of context that preceded it. I was 32 years old at the time, working as a senior financial analyst for a regional healthcare system in Charlotte, North Carolina, having built, across the preceding decade specifically, genuine financial stability through consistent, careful saving and disciplined budgeting. Habits I had developed, in part, as a direct response to watching, throughout my own childhood, our parents struggle with periodic financial instability that had shaped much of how I approached money as an adult. Courtney, 29 at the time of her wedding, had followed a considerably different path. 3 years younger than me, she had always possessed a warmth, spontaneity, and social ease that I, by contrast, had never quite managed to cultivate in the same natural way, qualities that had made her, across our entire childhood, the more immediately likable, more effortlessly popular of the two of us, in ways that our extended family had noticed and commented on more than once, usually without any particular malice, but in ways that had shaped how each of us understood our respective roles within the family. I had become, gradually across our childhood and considerably more explicitly across our adult years, the responsible one, a role I had initially accepted with some genuine pride, understanding myself as capable, dependable, someone our parents and eventually Courtney herself could rely on. What I hadn't fully anticipated, across the years that followed, was how thoroughly this role would eventually calcify into an expectation that extended considerably beyond simple sisterly support into something closer to an assumed financial safety net. The earlier pattern, in detail, I want to walk through, in more specific detail than I initially outlined, the actual history of financial support I had provided Courtney across the decade before her wedding, because I think the accumulated weight of this pattern matters enormously to understanding why the wedding crisis, when it finally arrived, felt less like an isolated incident and more like the culmination of something considerably longer in the making. The pattern began, in earnest, when Courtney was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in communications and no clear career direction, working a series of retail and hospitality jobs that provided inconsistent, generally insufficient income relative to her living expenses in Raleigh, where she'd settled after graduation. I covered, across an 8-month period that year, the difference between her actual income and her rent obligation, not a single dramatic bailout, but a quiet, ongoing monthly contribution that I transferred to her account without much discussion, or, I now recognize, without establishing any clear expectation about its temporary nature. When Courtney was 24, she experienced a considerably more significant financial crisis, having accumulated approximately $8,000 in credit card debt across roughly 18 months of what she later described, with genuine self-awareness, as just trying to keep up with everyone else's Instagram lives. A pattern of discretionary spending on travel, clothing, and social experiences that had outpaced her actual income considerably. I paid off this balance in full, again without establishing any formal repayment expectation, telling myself, at the time, that this represented a one-time, generous gift to help my sister establish better financial habits going forward, rather than a pattern I was, in fact, actively reinforcing through the absence of any genuine accountability. There were smaller instances, too, scattered across the years between these two more significant interventions and the eventual wedding crisis. A few $100s here for an unexpected car repair, a security deposit for a new apartment when Courtney needed to relocate quickly following a difficult breakup, occasional contributions toward family gifts or gatherings when Courtney's own budget apparently didn't accommodate her share. None of these individual instances, on their own, represented anything particularly dramatic or concerning. But I want to be honest that, cumulatively, across roughly a decade, I estimate I provided Courtney with financial support totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000 to $40,000 before the wedding crisis ever began. A figure I had never actually calculated formally until I sat down, in the aftermath of the wedding situation, and reconstructed it deliberately with my financial advisor's help. Specifically, to understand the full scope of the pattern I'd been part of establishing. How Courtney and Blake's relationship developed. I want to include some background on Courtney's relationship with Blake, because understanding their dynamic as a couple matters to understanding how the wedding planning process eventually spiraled into the specific crisis it became. Courtney met Blake in 2021 through mutual friends, and their relationship developed quickly into something both of them described, from early on, as genuinely serious and committed. Blake worked as a mid-level project manager for a construction firm, earning a solid, if unremarkable, income that, combined with Courtney's own more modest earnings as a marketing coordinator for a regional retail chain, provided the couple with a reasonably comfortable, if not especially affluent, combined household income once they moved in together in 2022. Blake, I want to be fair in nodding, was not the primary driver of the wedding's escalating budget. By most accounts, including his own, offered later during the crisis itself, he had expressed genuine concern, at multiple points throughout the planning process, about the wedding's growing cost, concerns that Courtney had, according to Blake's later account, consistently reassured him were under control, even as the actual financial reality diverged considerably from that reassurance. I kept asking her directly, Blake told me, during one of the difficult conversations that unfolded once the crisis became fully known, whether we could actually afford what she kept adding to the plans. She kept telling me not to worry about it, that she had it handled. I trusted her, maybe more than I should have, given how the numbers actually turned out. The specific escalation, month by month, I want to walk through, in somewhat more granular detail than I initially provided, exactly how Courtney and Blake's wedding budget escalated from its original, reasonable $22,000 figure to the eventual $72,000 total that would produce the $50,000 shortfall requiring my intervention. The original venue selection, made in August 2023, roughly 14 months before the wedding, was a modest community event space costing $4,500 for a full-day rental. A reasonable, budget-conscious choice consistent with the couple's original overall vision. By November 2023, following a friend's considerably more elaborate wedding at a historic estate property, Courtney had become genuinely enamored with a similar venue, ultimately switching their booking to a property costing $14,000, nearly triple their original allocation, justified at the time, according to Courtney's own later account, as just this one splurge, since everything else will stay within budget. This pattern repeated across the following months with remarkable consistency. The original modest catering plan, budgeted at $6,000 for a straightforward buffet-style dinner, expanded, by January 2024, into a $16.00 plated dinner service with an expanded menu and premium bar package. The original, simple floral arrangements, budgeted at $1,500, expanded into an $8,000 comprehensive floral design package following Courtney's engagement, with a considerably more elaborate wedding planner than originally intended. Each individual decision, considered in isolation, carried its own seemingly reasonable justification. A once-in-a-lifetime framing that Courtney applied with increasing frequency across the planning process, alongside a persistent pattern of comparison to friends' recent weddings that appeared to genuinely drive much of the escalating vision, even as the couple's actual combined income remained essentially unchanged throughout this same period. By June 2024, 4 months before the wedding, Courtney and Blake's total wedding spending commitment had reached approximately $72,000, a figure that exceeded their combined liquid savings by roughly $50,000, a gap Courtney had begun addressing through an increasingly precarious combination of two personal loans, totaling $28,000, and mounting credit card debt across 3 separate cards, totaling an additional $22,000. All without any clear, sustainable plan for how this debt would ultimately be managed or repaid. The weeks leading up to the crisis. I want to describe, in more detail, the specific weeks immediately preceding that venue coordinator's call, because understanding the mounting pressure during this period helps explain both Courtney's desperate decision to list me as a backup contact and the specific, disorienting suddenness with which the crisis ultimately arrived at my own doorstep. Courtney's credit cards, according to what I would eventually learn, began declining for various wedding-related payments starting in late September, roughly 3 weeks before the ceremony. Her response to these initial declined payments, rather than communicating the developing crisis directly to me or to our parents, was to attempt various stopgap measures on her own, applying for an additional personal loan, which was ultimately denied given her already substantial existing debt load, and attempting to negotiate extended payment timelines directly with several vendors, negotiations that met with limited success given how close the wedding date had become. It was during this period, apparently, though I only learned this detail after the fact, that Courtney had contacted the venue coordinator directly, requesting that I be added as a backup payment contact on the venue's contract. A request the coordinator, working from her own professional practices regarding large balance weddings, had apparently processed without any specific verification or direct contact with me. Treating it as a routine administrative addition, rather than something requiring my own explicit consent. I want to be honest that learning this specific detail, that Courtney had made this decision deliberately, weeks before the crisis actually reached me, rather than in some panicked, spontaneous moment, complicated my understanding of the situation considerably once I eventually pieced together the full timeline. The call itself, and my immediate reaction. I want to return to and expand upon the specific moment the venue coordinator's call arrived, because I think the visceral, immediate experience of that conversation matters to understanding everything that followed. I was in the middle of an entirely ordinary workday, reviewing quarterly budget projections for my hospital system's cardiology department, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I nearly let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a sales call, before something, perhaps simple instinct, made me answer. "Is this Jasmine Whitcomb?" the woman on the line asked, introducing herself as Patricia Alvarez, event coordinator for Ashford Manor, the venue where I knew, in general terms, that Courtney's wedding was scheduled to take place. "I'm calling regarding an outstanding balance on the Sorensen-Whitcomb wedding contract. You're listed as a backup payment contact, and unfortunately, we've been unable to process payment through the primary contacts method." I want to describe the specific, disorienting sequence of emotions that moved through me across the following several minutes of that call. Initial confusion, giving way to a mounting, sick understanding as Patricia explained the actual figures involved, followed by a distinct, cold anger once the full shape of the situation, including my own unauthorized listing as backup contact, became clear. "I need to be direct with you," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the practiced, careful diplomacy of someone accustomed to navigating exactly this kind of difficult financial conversation. "We have $50,000 in outstanding balances across the venue rental, catering, and floral contracts. Per our contract terms, If this isn't resolved within 48 hours, we and our partner vendors reserve the right to cancel all services for the October 19th date. I understand this is placing you in a difficult position, but I wanted to reach out directly given the very limited time remaining before the ceremony. I sat in my car for a long moment after ending that call, engine running, air conditioning blasting, working through the specific, layered shock of the situation. Not simply the financial crisis itself, significant as that was, but the deeper, more troubling revelation that my sister had apparently made a calculated decision, weeks earlier, to establish me as a financial fallback without ever informing me directly. The first conversation with Courtney. I want to expand considerably on the conversation that followed, because the initial version of this story compressed what was actually a much longer, more emotionally complex exchange into a relatively brief summary. I called Courtney immediately, and I could hear, from the moment she answered, that she already knew what this call was about. Her voice carried an immediate, anxious quality that told me she'd been anticipating and dreading exactly this conversation. "Jasmine, I can explain," she said, before I'd even had the chance to speak. "Explain what, Courtney?" I said, working to keep my voice level despite the anger I was genuinely feeling. "Explain why I just got a call from your venue coordinator telling me I'm on the hook for $50,000 I never agreed to. Explain why you apparently decided, weeks ago, to list me as some kind of financial guarantor for your wedding without ever once mentioning it to me directly." There was a long silence on the line before Courtney responded, and when she did, her voice carried genuine distress that I want to be fair in acknowledging, even as it didn't excuse the underlying decision. "I panicked, okay? The cards started declining, and I didn't know what else to do, and I guess some part of me just assumed, based on everything, honestly, based on years of you being the person who steps in when things go wrong, that you'd eventually be the one who fixed this. So I told the coordinator to list you, thinking I'd figure out how to actually tell you before it became urgent. And then I just kept putting it off because I didn't know how to have this conversation, and now it's a mess, Jasmine. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." "How much do you actually owe total?" I asked. "Not just this venue balance, everything." Courtney's answer, when it finally came, revealed the full scope of the financial crisis for the first time. $72,000 in total wedding costs, against which she and Blake had roughly $22,000 in savings, leaving the $50,000 gap now threatening the entire event, financed through debt that had already reached levels she described, with evident shame, as honestly kind of scary when I actually look at the total. Bringing Blake into the conversation. I want to include a significant conversation I had with Blake directly, separate from my conversations with Courtney, because his own perspective added important context to understanding the full situation. I called Blake the following morning, wanting to understand his own awareness and involvement in how the wedding budget had escalated to this point, given that any resolution would necessarily involve him as much as Courtney. "I want to be honest with you," Blake told me during this call. "I knew things were getting more expensive than we'd originally planned. I raised it with Courtney multiple times, especially after the venue change and then again when she brought on the more expensive florist. But every time I raised it, she reassured me she had it handled, that she was managing it, and I trusted her. I didn't know about the actual loans or the credit card debt until about 2 weeks ago, when she finally told me how bad things had actually gotten. I've been genuinely sick about this, Jasmine. This isn't the way I wanted to start a marriage, with this kind of secret debt hanging over both of us." This conversation mattered to me considerably, helping me understand that Blake, while not entirely without responsibility for not pushing harder on budget transparency earlier in the process, was not the primary architect of the crisis, and was, in fact, experiencing genuine distress about a situation Courtney had largely managed and obscured on her own. The family conversation. I want to include, in this expanded version, a significant family conversation that occurred during this same critical window, involving our parents, which I only briefly referenced in the original telling of this story. I called our parents, Diane and Robert, The same evening, I learned the full scope of the crisis, both to inform them of the situation and to understand whether they had any awareness of Courtney's financial difficulties before this point. My mother's reaction revealed, notably, that she had some limited awareness of Courtney's general financial stress throughout the wedding planning process, though not the specific scope of debt involved. She mentioned a few times that the wedding costs were adding up more than expected, my mother said, but I had no idea it had gotten this serious. I assumed, honestly, that you two had discussed it and that you were helping her manage it, the way you always have. This comment, delivered without any particular malice, but revealing, unmistakably, the family's broader, long-standing assumption about my role as Courtney's default financial safety net, struck me with particular force in that moment, crystallizing something I hadn't previously heard stated quite so directly. "Mom," I said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't know about any of this until yesterday, when a venue coordinator called me directly because Courtney listed me as a backup payment contact without ever asking me. This isn't me helping her manage it, the way I have in the past. This is a genuine crisis that's being placed on me without my consent, 4 days before her wedding." My father, notably, offered a somewhat different perspective during this same conversation, one that added useful context to my own eventual decision-making. "I think," he said, "your mother and I bear some real responsibility here too, Jasmine. We've watched this pattern develop across years, watched you step in repeatedly, and we've never really pushed back on it or helped Courtney build the kind of financial independence that might have prevented this specific situation. I don't think that absolves Courtney of her own responsibility in this, but I want you to know that whatever you decide to do here, we understand this isn't fair to expect of you, and will support whatever decision you make, even if that means the wedding doesn't happen as planned." This acknowledgement from my father meant considerably more to me than I initially expected, offering a kind of validation for feelings I'd been managing largely alone across the previous 24 hours. The difficult deliberation. I want to expand on the actual deliberation process I engaged in over the following day, because the original telling compressed what was genuinely one of the more difficult decision-making processes of my adult life into a relatively brief summary. I spent that evening, and much of the following morning, working through the decision with Marcus, my husband, who offered a perspective I found genuinely valuable throughout this process, supportive of whatever decision I ultimately reached, while also gently pushing me to examine my own motivations and the broader pattern this situation represented. "I think," Marcus told me, during one of our longer conversations that evening, "you need to separate two different questions here. One is whether you're willing to help prevent Courtney's wedding from being canceled, given the genuine, practical urgency of the situation. The other is whether you're willing to continue the broader pattern of unconditional financial rescue that's existed between you and Courtney for the past decade. I don't think you have to answer both questions the same way. You could decide to help with the immediate crisis while also, finally, establishing real boundaries and accountability going forward, rather than treating this as an all-or-nothing choice between complete rescue and complete refusal." This framing, I want to be honest, helped me considerably in eventually reaching the structured decision I ultimately made. Recognizing that the immediate, practical crisis and the longer-term pattern, while connected, didn't necessarily require an identical response. I also consulted directly with my financial advisor, Renee Castellanos, whom I'd worked with for several years managing my own savings and investment strategy, seeking clarity about the actual financial implications of potentially covering this $50,000 balance. "From a pure financial standpoint," Renee told me, "you have the liquid savings to cover this without genuinely jeopardizing your own financial stability, assuming you're not planning any major near-term expenses of your own that would be affected. The more important question, from where I sit, isn't really about whether you can afford this specific $50,000. It's about whether providing it, especially without any structure or accountability, continues to reinforce a pattern that clearly isn't serving your sister's own long-term financial development, based on everything you've described to me about the past decade." The decision, fully explained. I want to walk through, in more detail than the original telling provided, the actual conversation where I communicated my decision to Courtney, because the specific terms and reasoning I offered mattered considerably to everything that followed. I called Courtney the following afternoon, having spent the intervening time working through both the practical logistics of the payment itself and the specific terms I intended to propose. I've decided I'm going to cover the $50,000 balance, I told her, so your wedding can proceed as planned. But I need you to understand, clearly, that this is going to look different from every previous time I've helped you financially. This is going to be a formal loan, with an actual written agreement, a real repayment schedule, and genuine consequences if that schedule isn't maintained. I'm not doing this as another unconditional gift. I'm doing it because I don't want your wedding to be destroyed by this crisis, and because, despite everything, I love you and want this day to happen the way you and Blake have planned it. But going forward, our financial relationship is going to require real structure, starting with this loan. I want to describe Courtney's reaction in more detail than the original telling offered, because her response, across this longer conversation, revealed a more complicated emotional processing than the brief exchange I initially described. I don't know whether to feel grateful or humiliated, she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. I know I put you in an impossible position, and I know I've relied on you way more than I should have across the years. Part of me wants to just say yes to whatever terms you want, because I'm genuinely desperate right now. But another part of me feels like you're treating this like some kind of business deal instead of, I don't know, an actual family relationship. I understand why it feels that way, I told her. But Courtney, I think part of why we're in this specific crisis right now is precisely because our financial relationship has never had any real structure. You felt comfortable listing me as a backup contact without asking me directly because, across a decade, I've never established clear boundaries around what I'm willing to provide and under what circumstances. I'm not trying to punish you by formalizing this. I'm trying to build something that's actually sustainable for both of us going forward, rather than continuing a pattern that clearly isn't working, for you or for me. The practical resolution. I want to expand on the actual practical steps taken to resolve the immediate crisis, since the original telling moved through this portion relatively quickly. I contacted Patricia at the venue directly, informing her that I would personally cover the outstanding balance, and worked with her over the following day to process payment across the various affected vendor contracts. The venue itself, the catering company, and the floral design service, each requiring separate payment processing given the specific contractual structure Courtney and Blake had established with each individual vendor. This process, while ultimately successful in preserving the wedding date and preventing the vendor cancellations Patricia had initially warned about, required a genuinely stressful 48 hours of coordination, involving multiple phone calls, wire transfers, and documentation across several different vendor relationships, all compressed into the narrow window before the wedding itself. I want to note a specific, meaningful detail from this process. Blake insisted, once he understood the full scope of what I was doing, on personally calling me to express his own gratitude and notably his own commitment to the loan repayment structure, independent of whatever arrangement Courtney and I eventually formalized between us. I want you to know, Blake told me during this call, that I consider this loan a shared obligation between Courtney and me, not just something she needs to manage on her own. We're getting married in a few days, and that means her financial obligations are becoming mine too. I want to be directly involved in making sure we actually meet this repayment schedule, not leave it entirely on her shoulders. This commitment from Blake mattered considerably to me, offering some genuine reassurance that the eventual loan repayment would be approached as a shared responsibility between both members of the new marriage, rather than remaining solely Courtney's individual burden. The wedding itself. I want to describe the wedding day itself in somewhat more detail than the original telling provided, because the specific experience of attending a celebration I had, quite literally, just financially rescued days earlier, carried its own particular emotional complexity. The ceremony and reception, held that October weekend at Ashford Manor, unfolded, by every outward measure, as a genuinely beautiful, successful celebration. The elaborate venue, the expanded catering, the extensive floral arrangements, all the specific choices that had driven the budget's escalation, now fully realized in a wedding that guests would later describe, consistently, as one of the more elegant, memorable celebrations they'd attended in recent years. I want to be honest about my own complicated emotional experience throughout that day. Genuine joy watching my sister marry a man I believed, despite everything, genuinely loved her and would build a good life alongside her, mixed with a quieter, more private awareness of exactly what had been required, just days earlier, to ensure this particular celebration could actually proceed as planned. Courtney found me during a quiet moment in the reception, pulling me aside from the broader celebration for a brief, private conversation. "I know I haven't said this clearly enough yet," she told me, "but thank you. Not just for the money, though obviously that too. Thank you for the way you handled this whole situation, for not just writing a check and walking away, but for actually being honest with me about what needs to change." I think I needed to hear that more than I needed the money itself, even if it didn't feel that way in the moment. The formal loan agreement. I want to expand on the specific details of the formal loan agreement Courtney and I eventually established, since the original telling described this only briefly. We worked with an attorney, David Ostrander, recommended by my own financial advisor, to draft a formal, legally binding loan agreement in the weeks following the wedding. The agreement established a 5-year repayment schedule, with monthly payments of $875, reflecting the $50,000 principal, plus a modest 2% annual interest rate, considerably below typical market rates, but still meaningful enough to establish genuine financial accountability, beginning the month following the wedding itself. The agreement also included specific provisions addressing what would happen in the event of missed payments. Not punitive measures, but clear, structured consequences including required conversations about the underlying cause of any missed payment, and after 2 consecutive missed payments, a mandatory meeting with a financial counselor to reassess the couple's broader budget and spending patterns. I want to note that establishing this formal structure required its own difficult conversations, particularly regarding how to handle the reality that Courtney and I remained sisters, with an ongoing family relationship that extended considerably beyond this specific financial arrangement. We agreed, deliberately, to keep discussions of the loan itself largely separate from our broader sisterly relationship, where possible, meaning that regular family gatherings, holidays, and ordinary sisterly conversation would not become dominated by ongoing discussion of the loan's status, while still maintaining clear, direct communication whenever actual payment issues arose. The broader family reckoning. I want to expand considerably on the broader family conversation that unfolded in the months following the wedding, since this represented one of the more significant, if less immediately visible, outcomes of the entire crisis. Our parents initiated, at my father's suggestion, a series of family conversations specifically addressing the broader pattern of financial dynamics within our family, not simply focused on Courtney's specific situation, but examining more broadly how our family had, across decades, developed certain unexamined assumptions about financial responsibility and support between family members. "I think," my mother told me during one of these conversations, "your father and I inadvertently modeled some of this pattern ourselves, across your own childhood. We went through some genuinely difficult financial periods when you and Courtney were young, periods where extended family stepped in to help us in ways that, looking back, probably weren't always structured with the kind of accountability that might have been healthier for everyone involved. I think you and Courtney absorbed, without either of us fully intending it, a sense that family financial support should simply flow toward whoever needs it most urgently, without much examination of sustainability or fairness to whoever's providing that support. This broader family conversation, while not directly resolving the specific loan arrangement between Courtney and me, did produce genuine, meaningful shifts in how our extended family approached financial discussions going forward. More direct, explicit conversations about expectations and boundaries, rather than the previous pattern of assumed, unstructured support. Courtney's own financial journey. I want to expand considerably on Courtney's own process of addressing the underlying financial habits that had contributed to the wedding crisis, since this represented a significant, ongoing thread throughout the year following the wedding. Courtney began working with a financial counselor, Rebecca Simmons, roughly 6 weeks after the wedding, a process she pursued largely on her own initiative, though I want to be honest that our formal loan agreement structure, with its built-in provisions regarding financial counseling in the event of missed payments, likely provided additional motivation for pursuing this support proactively rather than waiting for an actual missed payment to trigger it. I think, Courtney told me, during a conversation roughly 4 months after the wedding, working with Rebecca has helped me understand something I hadn't really examined before, that a lot of my spending across years, not just the wedding specifically, has been driven by this constant, low-level comparison to other people's lives, especially on social media. I've started actually tracking my spending in detail for the first time in my adult life, and it's honestly been kind of humbling to see the actual patterns laid out clearly, rather than just feeling vaguely anxious about money without ever really understanding where it was actually going. This ongoing work, sustained across the following year, produced genuine, meaningful changes in Courtney's broader financial habits, not simply meeting the specific wedding loan repayment schedule, but developing, for what she described as the first time in her adult life, an actual, sustainable personal budget and savings practice independent of the loan itself. 1 year later, I want to expand significantly on the epilogue, providing considerably more detail about where things actually stood roughly 1 year after the initial crisis, since the original telling compressed this into a relatively brief summary. Courtney and Blake had, by the 1-year mark, maintained consistent, on-time payments across the full 12 months of their loan agreement, a pattern that represented, by any measure, a genuinely significant achievement given both the size of the debt and Courtney's own previous financial history. I want to describe a specific, meaningful moment from that 1-year mark. Courtney and Blake invited Marcus and me to dinner specifically to mark the anniversary of their wedding. And during that dinner, Courtney presented me with a document she'd prepared herself, a detailed spreadsheet tracking not just the loan repayment schedule, but her and Blake's broader household budget, savings goals, and progress toward what she described as actually building real financial stability, not just paying off this one specific debt. "I wanted you to see this," she told me, "because I think you deserve to know that this whole situation, as painful and humiliating as it was in the moment, actually changed something real for me. I don't think I would have ever built this kind of actual financial discipline if you just quietly paid off the debt the way you handled things in the past. I needed the structure, even though I fought against it at first." Epilogue, what this experience taught me. It has been just over a year since that venue coordinator's call disrupted an entirely ordinary workday, and my relationship with my sister has moved into a place considerably more honest, structured, and, I genuinely believe, sustainable than existed before this specific crisis, forced a reckoning our family had apparently needed for years, but had never organically found the occasion to have directly. I think, often, about the specific, disorienting moment I first understood that Courtney had listed me as a backup financial contact, without ever informing me directly. An act that, in the moment, felt like a genuine violation of trust, but that I've come to understand, with the benefit of considerable reflection, as the almost inevitable culmination of a pattern our entire family had participated in constructing across more than a decade. One where my own consistent reliability had gradually, without any single dramatic moment of decision on anyone's part, calcified into an assumed, unconditional safety net. I don't regret my decision to cover that $50,000 balance, even now, having watched the genuine cost and complexity of navigating that crisis across the following weeks and months. What I've come to value considerably more than the immediate resolution itself, though, is the structure and accountability I insisted on establishing alongside it. A decision that, I believe, ultimately served Courtney's genuine long-term well-being considerably more than another instance of quiet, unconditional rescue ever could have. Family, I've come to understand more clearly through this entire experience, isn't served well by unlimited, unstructured generosity, however loving its intentions. Real love, I think, sometimes requires the more difficult work of establishing genuine boundaries and accountability, even when doing so feels, in the moment, considerably less comfortable than simply quietly writing another check and hopping, without any real structure behind that hope, that things might eventually improve on their own.